Hello, Matthew Williams here with a quick video to talk to you about drone responsibility. Who is responsible for a drone? i.e., what happens if it goes wrong? Who is responsible for it having gone wrong? Now, this is an interesting point because theoretically, like somebody I was speaking to on a comment section, which is why I'm doing this video now, most people would say, well, you're much better off getting a drone from the manufacturer, all pre-built, all done by them, because that way, ready to fly, you know what you're getting, and it's going to be much safer, and therefore it's going to be better. And as the chap said, guy from Red TV Productions, he says he's not going to stick a really expensive camera on a drone if he doesn't know that it's been made well, and he won't stick it on there because it must be all good. And I kind of hear people with Apples, that kind of have a similar type of mentality. It's like, well, it's really expensive, so it must be good. And yet they're unaware of the fact that the latest MacBooks, for example, have a serious problem straight out of the factory. If you plug something into the USB, the Wi-Fi goes off and is unreliable. That's straight out of the factory. Costs loads of money. Yeah, you can add Apple Care to it and they'll replace it, but you only get a few times to do that, and then kind of all your money's taken up and you've only still got a machine that maybe only works to the spec that they sent it out from the factory. Now, my contention, which was vehemently denied by the chap, is that because he doesn't know what he's doing, he would only buy one from the factory because that is better, and he would never trust one that has been homemade, because the ones that are homemade are always the ones that crash and fall apart and are always in bits. These are just elitist assumptions, and I've rebutted this and said, well, actually, the problem is DJI is a very big company, but it does not have the best record for the speed or the agreeing to repairing its equipment. So much so that they've even done the Apple thing of putting in an insurance policy so that you're paying insurance with them, so that if you crash it, there's a no kind of fault thing, we'll just replace it. But they only do that a couple of times. And it is expensive. When you consider the price of, say, a new Mavic is $1,000, it'll be 150 quid, which is a tenth of the price of the product in order to replace it. That's a pretty hefty insurance amount on £1,000. Yeah, you'd get a lot more insurance back for a car than you are on these drones, because the amount the car is worth and the amount that you'd have to get paid to get it repaired or replaced is definitely a lot more. So let's come back to this point, because it's really important about what is better: manufacturer made, manufacturer fully ready to fly straight out of the box from the manufacturer, or one you've built yourself. You can't trust those. Here it is in a nutshell. Now, I've got a microlight pilot's license, I learned to fly in big aircraft, but I did my microlights pilot license. That's what I finished it all off with. Now, I've seen how it works both ways, because in big aircraft that you would learn to fly in and you pay to rent from a club, those are classed as commercial. Because they're commercial, it means that you cannot do the work on that aircraft yourself. In fact, even if it wasn't commercial, even if it was only for pleasure flight, it's in a category of aircraft that means that you are not qualified enough to touch that aircraft in a servicing capacity. There are only a couple of things you can do. You can change the spark plugs. I'm not even sure you're allowed to do that in some cases. You can change the oil, you can drain the fuel, and you can refill the fuel. Beyond that, you are not allowed to mess with that aircraft, because if you do, you invalidate the safety certificate for that aircraft, and you will not be insured to fly it. Now, okay, let's come down to microlights. Bear with me, right? You'll see the way this kind of works down the line, okay? Come to microlights. They're in a different category, which means that there are certain restrictions placed on how you fly them, what you can do with them, you know, whether or not you're allowed to do acrobatics in them, you know. A lot of them you're not allowed to do that because they're not certified for it, okay? And because they're not certified for it, the insurances are less, but you're only allowed to do a certain amount. Like you can only take one passenger in a microlight, you know, in the UK. Not the same in all countries, but in the UK. Now then, because there are restrictions on what you can do with that microlight, they allow you to do the work on that microlight yourself. So if you're confident enough, you can actually do the work yourself on the microlight, and that's all you have to do is get somebody who is of a similar competence to check your work, and you can sign that off yourself. Now, once a year you will have to get an MOT, which you have to do with the big aircraft like the Cessnas, the commercial stuff. You have to get all those. They have to be professionally done by a trained, certified engineer. But microlights, you can get that done with a slightly lower grade of engineer, okay, who can sign it off and test fly it. And then you can say, right, once a year, there's your aircraft MOT. Right, okay. If you are prepared to just fly on your own, just you, no passenger, okay, the insurance is going to be even less. You can reclassify that aircraft as being single seat. And then you can do all the work yourself. You do not have to have anyone to check your work, but you're not allowed to fly over certain areas and near places because it's more risky that the aircraft might fall apart because you made it, okay? But you can do all the work yourself. Now, being a microlight pilot and having owned a microlight, I like the design of microlights because they're all quite open and you can look through gaps and you can see where the wires and the pulleys go and all the bolts. You can see everything. So there is the potential, if you wish to do it, when you do your checks, you can check every nut and bolt on that aircraft. Because ultimately, in a microlight aircraft and in a single seat aircraft, not in a commercial one, but in a microlight and a single seat, the responsibility for whether that aircraft is safe to fly is with the pilot. Okay? If something happens to that aircraft, provided the pilot has done all his checks, it's still your responsibility. I could not go back to the people who did a repair for me and say it's their fault because I still have to check it before I fly it. It's my responsibility. It comes down to the pilot. It is the pilot's responsibility to make sure that the aircraft is safe. Now, it is still the pilot's responsibility to check that a Cessna is safe, but that's in a higher category of what you can check because as a pilot, you can't go taking off panels and checking where all the wires go. You have to allow that certified mechanic to do all the stuff that you can't do and go in the places you can't go and peek in there with equipment to check things that you can't check. So here's the conundrum. Which do you feel more confident flying in? Well, if it's been checked by a super aircraft mechanic who's got all the paperwork and went to school and, you know, but you're still trusting that aircraft mechanic to do everything right and for him to not forget a single bolt or anything. Okay? Now, that's why I like microlights a bit better because they're actually designed for you to look at where everything goes and they're a much more simplified thing. So you can check every nut and bolt, okay? And it's your responsibility. If you had an accident in a big Cessna, you could justifiably, and obviously the air investigation people would come in and look at it and they would say, right then, well, whose fault is it? Is it the pilot or is it the engineer? Who is it? Who's it responsibility? Now, this is where it's going to come clear in a minute. I'll be back to drones now. Keep with me, okay? Okay, so now, Is it your fault as the pilot because something went wrong, in the airframe of the aircraft or the mechanics or whatever, yeah? Or is it the engineer's fault? And they will try to apportion who's to blame, who should have been doing the checks on this aircraft. But with a microlight, if anything goes wrong, ultimately they will say it is the pilot's responsibility. Yeah, you can kind of try and apportion blame onto somebody else and say, oh, they didn't do a very good job. But ultimately, if you're going to fly that microlight, it is your responsibility. So back to drones. Okay. The people who tell me, oh, no, I'd never ever build one myself and all this sort of stuff, right? If you don't know how the drone works because you don't build it yourself, you're just somebody who just picks up something. Oh, yeah, I picked it up and I never read the manual. And look, hey, look, Mum, I'm flying. Oh, yeah. And if you... Oops, I turned it on now, but mistake. But the point being, if you speak to that person about how does it work? What is communicating with what? What are the factors involved here? How do the batteries operate? How should you charge them, discharge them? What are the factors? Cold, pressure, altitude, all these factors that make up the aircraft that they're flying. Most people will go, what are you on about? Because they didn't do a commercial test, they haven't learnt how all these systems work. And even if they did a commercial test, there'd only be a little bit of knowledge there, right? Now, somebody who builds them tends to know a bit more about it because there's a hell of a lot more that goes into it. If you don't build it correctly, it probably won't even get off the ground. So you have to know a bit more about it. So it's like saying, are you just somebody who gets in a car and drives it down the road and then the wheel flies off? Yeah, because the wheel nuts weren't tightened, because you didn't bother to check them before you went driving, Well, whose fault is that? Yeah? Well, it's your fault. It's your fault because you should have checked the wheel nuts were tight before you went for a drive. Again, whose responsibility? So whose responsibility is it when a drone falls out of the sky? Okay, all right, if you've paid for insurance, you can get another one given to you free, from the company. But whose responsibility is it if that drone fell out of the sky and landed on somebody's head, or if it just lands when you're in the middle of a commercial shoot? You're in the middle of a commercial shoot, you've got a massive drone, it's got a really expensive camera underneath it, and it's flying along, and all of a sudden, rah, bang, and it just destroys 30,000 pounds worth of camera gear, and a 10,000 pound drone. Whose responsibility is that? Well, of course, the chap from Red TV, he's kind of like, well, I'm paying good money, it's their responsibility, I'll sue them. Really? You'll sue them, will you? Like to see how far you get with that? Well, have you ever heard anybody tell you the little anecdote that if you take your car for an MOT, right, you take it to the garage, they do the MOT, which is a check, British check, we call it an MOT. Don't know what you call it in the States, but they do a check, a safety check on your car. Then you're given a certificate, then you can get your insurance, then you can drive the car. If you don't have the MOT, a valid MOT, you can't get the insurance is invalid, you can't drive the car. So you've got to have all this paperwork's got to be there. If any one piece of the paperwork isn't there and you have an accident, it's your responsibility. But say you go into a garage, you get the MOT work done on the car, and you drive out of the garage, and you drive down the road, and the wheel collapses, yeah? You cannot go back to the MOT station and say, well, it's their fault because they just did a test on this. Do you know what they say? The test is only valid for the time that we're doing the test. Once we've finished the test, the responsibility is yours because it's your car, and we do basic check tests. If something goes wrong outside of the parameters, even if we've tested it, it's your responsibility. Right? So they won't accept responsibility. Well, I wonder if the same applies to the drone world. Because it certainly applies to the microlight world. And to a certain extent, everyone will try and get themselves off the hook. So here's the thing. Let's pretend that we are like this Red TV Productions, okay? And they say, well, it should work. I bought it from the manufacturer. It was all set up and it was made by them and it was ready to fly. All I had to do was put the arms up and turn it on and do the compass check and then go flying. Yeah? And it crashed. And you know what they'll say? Describe to us exactly what you did before you went flying. It's reasonable, isn't it? Tell us what you did so we can better understand the problem here. And you say, well, I put the battery on, I checked it was charged, I charged them up all the night before, they were all warm, I put them on the copter, I did my checks. And they say, well, go into more detail. What did you actually do? And they say, well, I checked the blades were on and tight, and I put the arms up. And you locked them as well, did you? Yes, I locked the arms, and yeah, great. And what else did you do? And they're like, well, I kind of I did the compass check, and then I kind of checked that the camera was working and the gimbal was working. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And then what else did you do? And they're like, well, I did all my checks. And then I went flying. And it fell out of the sky. Do you know what they'll say to you? Well, you didn't do many checks then, did you? Not our responsibility. Sorry. Yeah? Because ultimately, you should check all the screws are tight. You should check that all the screws have got Loctite in them, because the vibration will cause them to untighten. You cannot afford to take any chances when flying over people, like if you're in a commercial environment, flying over actors, and things like this, hovering above people's heads with a copter. If you haven't actually taken that copter and checked every nut, every bolt, every screw, every wire, every single part, you've taken everything off, you've checked it all, put it all back together, made sure that it's not going to break, make sure there's no fractures that can't be seen underneath in arms that seem okay. You should be putting those arms under pressure to see if they can take the pressure. You should be weighing the copter down. You should be test flying it away from people before you fly it near them. You should be throwing the copter around in the sky to see if you can make it crash. Yeah, you should be doing all of those things before you attempt to fly it in the normal mode. Yeah, if you just do basic checks, yeah, and it's ready to fly, so you think, and you go flying, they will tell you to shove it up your bottom. Quite rightly so too, I think. They will tell you to shove that right up your bottom, because, quite frankly, you are not taking full responsibility for your aircraft. Okay, and they build them and put them together to a certain level, and when they give them to you, they give them to you so-called ready to fly. And as they tell you, they're not actually ready to fly. The last bit is down to you, and it always will be. They will never give you something that is 100% ready to fly. Yeah, even if it means putting the blades on. That means you're doing something. That means you're servicing that aircraft. And if you're servicing that aircraft, even like that, it means that you are doing the maintenance. And if you're doing the maintenance, you're fully responsible in checking all systems that are reasonably checkable by a person before you go flying. So whose responsibility is it? It's yours. If you land on somebody's head, you can try and sue DJI, yeah, or you can try and sue the shop that sold you the copter, but ultimately they'll say, did you check it before you went flying? And they will want to know that you checked it thoroughly before taking it up. And if you can't say you did, I don't think they will accept any responsibility. And that's why these aircraft are supplied slightly not finished. They always are, because it always returns the responsibility to the owner to finish the work. So when I hear from somebody, I would never buy something that's been made by somebody. Yeah. I would rather know that a shop had put it together and spent a lot of time, and people I know and I can see, right, just like with the aircraft, like with the Cessna, see the person putting it together, know them, yeah, know that person. But if some unknown engineer you've never even met is playing with this stuff and you never get to meet them, you don't know whether you trust that person. Yeah, okay, they've got a certificate, a piece of paper that says they do it, but as we know, even 747s fall out of the sky because somebody forgot to put some bolts in, or used the wrong bolts and this sort of stuff. Whose responsibility is it? Well, ultimately, the responsibility comes down to the pilot. It comes down to the aircraft operators. It's their responsibility, yeah, and it will be subdivided, but ultimately the plane still comes out of the sky. That's the problem. What you want to try and avoid is not responsibility for who you're going to sue. That does not fix a problem, okay? Right? That does not get you anything apart from money. It will not bring you back onto schedule if you're trying to do a shoot. It will not put the scalp back on Leonardo DiCaprio if you chop his scalp off with one of your blades. Okay, it's not going to put his scalp back on, and it's not going to get you back in the air quickly if you have a crash. Now, here's the point. If you build your own copters, you've usually got spare parts. If you build your own copters, you usually know what all these parts do. Okay? DJI have got a horrible reputation for taking ages to repair stuff, arguing the toss about whose responsibility it is, just like any insurance company would, yeah, and trying to get themselves out of the responsibility. So here's the thing. I have been to companies that service these copters, and I have stood there and I have looked at, folding wing systems, 900s and matrices and things like that, in bits, smashed to smithereens. Right? And I've said to the people standing there, and you can see they're horrified, and they don't know what all these parts do. They're just cameramen, they don't understand drones. They're just like, I've got a very expensive camera and I work for the BBC. This thing's supposed to do what it's meant to do, and I bought it to make it do what it meant to do, and then it fell out of the sky. So they don't really know what they're doing, and they're not even expected to have an extremely high knowledge of what they're doing in order to pass the commercial test. Yeah, and there they are. They have to bring it back to the shop to get it repaired. Now, how many days is it going to take for them to get that repaired? Right? And how much effort is it going to get to put more cameras and gimbals back on there and test it, because they'll all have to be tested and tweaked to get them flying properly. It's going to take days off your shooting schedule, right? Now, here's the alternative. Imagine that you didn't buy it from a shop. Imagine that you bought that aircraft from somebody who's a specialist, or somebody you know, or you built it yourself. Yeah? It crashes. Yeah? You have the parts. Yeah, you take it apart, several hours later, you're probably going to be back in the air. So if you say you're a professional TV company and you demand results and, you'll sue the company and it's still not going to help you, is it? It does not help you get your program back on schedule. Yeah, you're responsible for the mayhem and the megabucks that are lost and all that. That's your responsibility, because you're the drone pilot. You're the one saying, if we fly this now, this is going to do the job. And when it doesn't, you're expected to have spares. You'll have to have 2 or 3 spare copters, 2 or 3 spare Red Epic cameras, or be able to go out and hire one, immediately and stick it on, and all the gimbals, and put it all back together immediately. So you're expected to have spares. If you're a television company and you've got one drone, and you bought it from the manufacturer, and you're flying around with your Red Epic on it, yeah, and you've got nothing to back it up if it goes wrong, yeah, I'm sorry, that sounds silly to me. That's an accident waiting to happen. You are wanting to be like those guys from the BBC who I saw standing there, and they're like, we paid lots of money for this, and it's like smashed all our cameras up and we can't film now. And there they are, and they're waiting to have a repair done. and they've got to go in line with all the other people who are trying to be repaired, or they might have to pay extra money to jump to the front of the queue to be repaired first by this shop, and it's still going to take days to get it all tweaked and ready. It's just a nightmare. It's just an absolute nightmare. So here we are. One side is, do you build them yourself, or do you buy them from the manufacturer ready to fly? Which one is going to be better for keeping you flying? Which one's going to be better for getting you back into action quicker, right? Are you just a pilot of these things, or do you know what you're talking about? Now, I'm not prepared to accept from people who say, "Oh, I would never do that because because it's just crap." People who make their own stuff, it's just crap. Yeah, I would rather have somebody who makes their own stuff there as a pilot or a co-pilot, or just sitting in the background ready for when something goes wrong as the insurance policy to get you back in the air quickly. Because if you're just a pilot of these systems and you don't understand how they work, having you there on that chute is probably a liability, because you're a risk to the people you're flying around because you don't properly understand the stuff. And also you're putting the schedule of any project at risk by the fact that, if your copter goes down, game over for the project. Yeah, you'll have to come back on another day. You're going to lose time. It's going to cost a lot of money. Now, that's just from a commercial point of view. Now, I don't operate commercially, right? But I'm just thinking how these things work. So there we go. And how many companies are there out there? And you see it happening a lot. They got one copter, and maybe one little spare Phantom, in backup. Yeah, I mean, you're working in professionally, I would have thought you'd got 2 or 3 of these things, yeah, and you know what you're talking about. So thanks very much for watching. But it's interesting though, isn't it? Who's actually responsible? It's the pilot. Thanks very much for watching.